I accidentally found my husband's old credit card in his old jacket. When I called the bank to check the balance, the manager said, "Ma'am, the balance on this card is $77 million. But we had always lived poor. When I asked where it came from. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think contentment was a kind of currency, and for 6 years, Daniel and I had been rich in it even when our bank account said otherwise. We lived in a rented duplex on Maple Street in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place with a furnace that groaned every winter and a kitchen too small for both of us to cook in at once. Daniel worked as a senior accountant at a logistics firm, and I taught ESL classes at the community college. We clipped coupons. We drove a 2014 Civic with a cracked windshield we kept promising to fix. We hadn't taken a real vacation since our honeymoon. When I brought up the idea of trying for a baby, Daniel always had the same gentle, tired answer. "Let's wait until things are more stable." I believed him because I had no reason not to. It was 3 years after his father, Robert Whitman, passed away that the small inconsistencies started. At first they were nothing. A strange phone call Daniel took on the porch instead of the living room, his voice low enough that I couldn't make out the words. Then it became a pattern. Once a month, sometimes more, he'd drive the 4 hours to Hartford, Connecticut to see his mother, Eleanor, and his sister, Claire. He called it family business, and when I asked what kind of business required so much of his time, he'd just say, "Estate stuff, boring legal things. You don't want to be involved." I noticed other things too. At Christmas, Daniel had handed Claire an envelope I wasn't supposed to see, and from the way her face lit up, it wasn't a card. Another time, I'd watched him quietly transfer $200 to his mother's account from our joint checking, money we genuinely didn't have to spare that month, and when I asked about it, he'd snapped at me, which wasn't like him at all. "It's complicated, Sarah. Just trust me." Complicated. That word started showing up more and more, like a wall he was building one brick at a time. I told myself it was grief. Losing a father changes people, and maybe managing an estate really was as tedious and draining as he made it sound. I didn't want to be the wife who turned every secret into suspicion, so I let it go. The way you let go of a splinter you can't quite dig out. Not gone, just buried a little deeper under the skin. The day everything cracked open started as nothing special. I was reorganizing our hall closet, pulling out winter coats to donate before the new season, when I found an old gray blazer of Daniel's shoved in the back, something he hadn't worn in years. As I checked the pockets before bagging it for goodwill, my fingers closed around a stiff rectangle of plastic. A credit card. Black. No logo I recognized. Just a string of numbers and Daniel's name embossed across the front. It looked ancient. The kind of card I assumed had been canceled years ago. Maybe something tied to his father's old business. Curious more than suspicious, I dialed the number on the back, half expecting an automated message telling me the account no longer existed. A man with a calm, professional voice answered instead. "Whitman Family Trust Services. This is Gregory speaking. How can I help you?" I stumbled through an explanation. "Found this card. Just want to know if it's still active. Sorry to bother you." He asked a few verification questions. My name, Daniel's date of birth, the last 4 of his social. Then there was a pause, the sound of typing. "Ma'am," he said, "the available balance on this account is $77 million. I laughed, actually laughed, certain I had misheard him, certain this was some kind of system error. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" He repeated it, slower this time, like he was speaking to someone who needed extra patience. 77 million. I stood there in my hallway holding a phone in one hand and a moth-eaten blazer in the other, surrounded by boxes of clothes we'd kept because we couldn't afford to replace them, and I felt the floor of my entire marriage tilt beneath me. I hung up the phone and sat down right there on the hallway floor because my legs didn't feel capable of holding me anymore. $77 million. The number didn't even feel real. It felt like something from a news article about someone else's life, not a sentence that belonged in my house, on my husband's name, in my hand. The first thing that came wasn't anger. It was grief. Strange as that sounds, a sudden flood of memory for every small sacrifice I had quietly made and never once complained about. The fertility specialist appointment I canceled because the consultation fee alone was $300 we didn't have. The wedding of my college roommate I missed because I couldn't justify the plane ticket. The space heater we ran in our bedroom every winter instead of fixing the furnace, because Daniel said a repair like that would set us back months. Every "we can't afford it" replayed in my head like a cruel joke, because apparently somewhere we could afford almost anything. I thought about calling Daniel right then, screaming the number at him over the phone until he had to explain himself. But something held me back. Not fear of him exactly, but a colder, more practical instinct. If I confronted him with nothing but a phone call and raw emotion, he would have time to construct an explanation, to soften it, to make me feel like I was overreacting before I even understood what I was reacting to. And some part of me, the part that had spent years noticing his evasiveness without naming it, suspected this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. So instead, I did something that surprised even me. I put the blazer in the donation pile like nothing had happened, slid the card into the zippered pocket of my purse, and waited for Daniel to come home for dinner as if it were any other Tuesday. That night, I watched him eat his pasta and talk about a coworker's retirement party, and I studied him the way you study a stranger. The small habits I'd stopped noticing after 6 years of marriage. The way he avoided eye contact when the subject of his family came up. The way his shoulders tightened slightly whenever his phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen before deciding whether to answer in front of me. I had been living next to a locked door for years and calling it a wall. The next morning, after he left for work, I called the trust line again, this time asking more careful questions, writing everything down in a notebook I bought specifically for this purpose. The representative, more cautious this time after my first call had presumably been flagged, would only confirm that the account was associated with something called the Whitman Family Trust, and that for further details I would need to speak with the trustees directly. Whitman Family Trust. Robert Whitman, Daniel's late father, had died 3 years earlier after a long illness, leaving behind, as far as I'd always understood, a modest house in Hartford and not much else. Daniel had told me there wasn't really an inheritance to speak of. that medical bills had eaten up whatever savings his parents had. I had believed him, because why would I not? I realized, sitting at our kitchen table with my notebook open, that I needed information before I needed confrontation. If I went to Daniel now, armed with nothing but a number and a question, I would be at the mercy of whatever story he chose to tell me. I needed to understand what this trust actually was, who controlled it, and why, after 3 years of supposed poverty, a card tied to $77 million had been hiding in our hall closet. That afternoon, I searched online for estate and trust attorneys in our area. Not divorce lawyers, not yet. Just someone who could explain in plain terms what a family trust was and what rights, if any, a spouse had to information about one. I found a small firm 20 minutes away with decent reviews and booked a consultation under the vague pretense of financial planning questions, not ready to say the real reason out loud to anyone, including myself. For the first time since that phone call, I felt something steadier than panic. A plan, however small, however uncertain. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to accuse. I was going to find out exactly what I was dealing with before I let anyone, including my own husband, tell me how to feel about it. The attorney's office smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and the woman who greeted me, Patricia Voss, had the unhurried manner of someone who had seen every kind of family secret cross her desk. I told her, carefully, that my husband's late father had apparently left behind a trust, that I'd recently learned of its existence, and that I wanted to understand what rights a spouse or beneficiary might have to information about it. She explained the basics patiently. In most cases, a beneficiary of a trust, which Daniel almost certainly was, given his father's death, had a legal right to request an accounting, a full disclosure of the trust's assets, income, and distributions, especially if there was any suspicion of mismanagement. As for me, as Daniel's wife, my rights depended on the state's marital property laws and whether any of the trust's distributions had been commingled with our household finances. If money from this trust has ever touched your joint accounts, she said, that opens a different conversation entirely. I left her office with a folder of notes and a referral to a forensic accountant if it came to that, feeling, for the first time in days, like the ground beneath me had a little more structure to it. What I didn't know yet was that my first phone call to the trust line hadn't gone unnoticed. Gregory, the representative I'd spoken to, had apparently flagged the inquiry as unusual activity on a dormant-seeming account, and a notification had gone out to the trust's listed administrators. Eleanor Whitman, Daniel's mother, held that title, and Eleanor mentioned it almost in passing to her daughter Claire during one of their weekly calls. Someone called asking about the balance, Eleanor said. Probably nothing. Probably Daniel being careless with his cards again. But Claire, sharper and more anxious than her mother gave her credit for, asked a question that made Eleanor pause. What if it wasn't Daniel who called? I didn't know any of this yet, of course. All I knew was that 2 days after my consultation with Patricia, I found myself alone in our house on a Saturday afternoon while Daniel was at the gym, and I made a decision I'd been circling for a week. He kept a small locked drawer in the bottom of his home office desk, the kind of drawer that had always seemed entirely unremarkable to me, holding, I'd assumed, old tax documents and warranty papers. I knew where he kept the spare key. taped beneath the drawer above it, a hiding spot so unimaginative it almost felt like an invitation. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. Inside, beneath a stack of old pay stubs, was a manila folder labeled simply WFT in Daniel's handwriting. I sat down on the office floor and opened it. The documents inside were dense with legal language, but the core of it became clear within a few pages. The Whitman Family Trust had been established by Robert Whitman years before his death, funded substantially by the sale of a manufacturing business none of us had ever discussed in detail. The trust's current value, as of the most recent statement included in the folder, was just over $77 million. Daniel was listed as a primary beneficiary, entitled to discretionary distributions and a full inheritance upon certain conditions. Eleanor was named as trustee. Claire was named as co-trustee. And buried in a clause near the end, written in the dry, careful language of lawyers, was a provision requiring family consensus before any major distribution could be released to Daniel. Consensus that, as trustee and co-trustee, only Eleanor and Claire could provide. I sat there for a long time, holding proof of everything Daniel had let me believe was untrue. He wasn't just keeping a secret from me. He was a man entitled to a fortune, kept on a leash by his own mother and sister, and either complicit in the lie or controlled by it so completely that he'd let our marriage live in artificial poverty rather than challenge them. I photographed every page with my phone before sliding the folder back exactly as I'd found it, locking the drawer and returning the key to its hiding place. My hands had stopped shaking by the time I heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway. Something had shifted in me, quiet and absolute. I no longer needed to ask whether something was being hidden from me. I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. I didn't confront Daniel that weekend or the next. I needed those days to settle the trembling in my chest into something closer to resolve, because I knew that whatever conversation came next would reshape the entire architecture of our marriage. And I didn't want to walk into it as a wounded wife flinging accusations. I wanted to walk into it as someone who had already done the work of understanding exactly what she was looking at. Instead, I called Patricia Voss again and told her, this time, the full truth about the trust documents, the $77 million, the consensus clause that left Daniel's inheritance hostage to his own mother's approval. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a slow, deliberate hand. And when I finished, she set her pen down and said something that settled into me like a verdict. If what you're describing is accurate, your husband may be the victim of financial control by his family, and depending on how trust distributions have historically been handled, there could also be grounds to investigate mismanagement or breach of fiduciary duty. She recommended we move carefully but formally. A written request, through her office, for a full accounting of the trust, sent directly to Eleanor as trustee, copying Daniel as beneficiary, so that there could be no ambiguity later about who had initiated what and when. I made the decision to involve Daniel before the letter went out, not to protect him, but because I needed to know whether the man I'd married had been complicit in this or simply trapped by it. I sat him down on a Sunday evening, the photographed documents printed and stacked neatly on the coffee table between us, like evidence in a trial only the two of us were attending, and I told him everything. The card, the call to the bank, the locked drawer, the spare key taped where anyone determined enough could find it. His face went through something I'd never seen before, a kind of slow unraveling, the muscles around his eyes loosening as if a mask he'd been wearing for years had finally cracked under its own weight. He didn't deny it. He told me, voice breaking in places I hadn't heard break before, not even at his father's funeral, that his mother had drilled into him for years that any woman he married would inevitably try to take the family's money, that she'd convinced him secrecy was protection, not just for the trust, but for our marriage itself, so that I would supposedly love him for himself and not for what he stood to inherit. He'd been ashamed, he said, of how much control she still held over him, even as an adult, ashamed enough that he'd rather let me believe we were poor than admit how thoroughly he'd allowed his mother to script his entire adult life. He hadn't told me because some buried part of him had been afraid I'd resent him for staying quiet so long, or worse, that the secrecy was the only language he knew how to use to keep peace with his mother. It wasn't a clean confession, and it didn't erase the years of lies, the canceled vacations, the fertility appointment I'd given up on. But it told me what I needed to know. He hadn't been hiding the money from me to hurt me. He'd been hiding from his own family's grip, and I had simply been collateral damage in that fear, an unintended casualty of a war that had started decades before I ever entered his life. We sat together at that table for nearly 2 hours, talking through what it would mean to challenge that grip, what we stood to lose, what we might gain, what kind of marriage we wanted to build on the other side of it. By the end of the night, we agreed together that the letter requesting a formal accounting would go out the following week. It went out on a Wednesday. By Friday, Eleanor and Claire were standing in our driveway, having driven the 4 hours from Hartford without calling ahead, their car still running behind them as if they hadn't fully committed to staying. Eleanor's voice was sharp in a way I'd never heard before, all pretense of warmth gone, replaced by something brittle and furious. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Sarah? Going through private family documents, hiring lawyers? Do you have any idea what you could destroy?" Claire stood slightly behind her mother, arms crossed tight against her chest, her expression somewhere between fury and panic that struck me as oddly specific, more frightened than the situation seemed to warrant for someone who supposedly had nothing to hide. I noticed her eyes kept flicking toward Eleanor, as if checking which lines were safe to say out loud. "We're asking for an accounting," I said, keeping my voice level even as my pulse hammered hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "That's all. Daniel is a beneficiary. He has a right to know what's happened to his father's trust." "You don't know what you're playing with," Eleanor snapped, stepping closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume cutting through the cold evening air. "If you keep pushing this, I will make sure Daniel sees nothing from that trust. Not now, not ever. Is that what you want? To destroy your own husband's inheritance out of greed?" Daniel, standing beside me, said the first thing in this confrontation that surprised his mother more than it surprised me. "It's not her decision alone, Mom. It's mine too, and I want the accounting." His voice didn't waver, and I felt his hand find mine, gripping it tightly, the two of us a single unit for the first time in this entire ordeal. Eleanor's face went rigid with something between disbelief and fury. the kind of expression I imagine she rarely allowed herself in public, and after a long, tense silence that stretched out longer than any of us seemed comfortable with, she turned without another word and walked back to her car, Claire trailing behind her, throwing one last glare over her shoulder before they drove off into the dark, gravel crunching under the tires in a way that felt almost violent. We stood in the driveway long after their taillights disappeared down the street, neither of us speaking, the cold air doing little to settle the heat still pulsing through my chest. That night, exhausted in a way that felt bone deep, deeper than simple tiredness, I told Daniel I needed a few days away, not from him, but from all of it, the documents, the threats, the sheer accumulated weight of what we'd uncovered in just over a week. I drove 3 hours to my mother's house in Indiana the next morning, leaving my phone on silent for most of the weekend, letting myself simply breathe before the next part of this began. My mother's kitchen smelled like cinnamon and old wood, the same way it had smelled my entire childhood, a constancy that felt almost shockingly grounding after a week that had upended everything I thought I knew. For 2 days I let myself be nothing but a daughter again, peeling potatoes at her counter, walking her dog around the block in the cold, saying very little about why I'd shown up unannounced and looking, as she put it the moment I walked through her door, like you've aged 5 years in a week. She didn't push. She made tea, kept the television on low in the background, and let the silence between us do its slow, patient work. When I finally told her the whole story, the card, the bank, the trust, the threats in our driveway, the way Eleanor's voice had cracked into something almost frightening, she didn't gasp or panic the way I'd half expected, the way I might have in her position. She just nodded slowly, the way people do when something finally makes sense of years of half-explained behavior, pieces clicking quietly into place behind her eyes. I always wondered why that family kept Daniel on such a short leash, she said, stirring her tea. Even at your wedding, his mother watched him like she was afraid he'd say the wrong thing. It was the kind of plain, grounding statement I needed, delivered without drama, without the kind of theatrical outrage that might have made me feel more agitated rather than less. My mother wasn't going to fix this for me, and she knew it, but she didn't need to fix anything. She just needed to remind me I wasn't losing my mind, that what I'd uncovered was real and verifiable, and not some product of my own insecurity, and that wanton honesty in my own marriage wasn't greed, no matter what Eleanor had tried to make me feel standing in that driveway. By the time I drove back to Dayton on Sunday evening, the highway stretching long and quiet under a gray sky, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Calm. Not the calm of someone who had stopped caring, but the calm of someone who had stopped being afraid of the conflict itself, who had finally accepted that this fight, however ugly it became, was not optional anymore. That calm was tested almost immediately. On Tuesday afternoon, while I was grading essays at my kitchen table, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and against my better judgment, curiosity winning out over caution, I answered. It was Claire. Her voice was different than it had been in the driveway. Softer, almost conspiratorial, the tone of someone trying a new strategy after the old one had failed spectacularly. Sarah, I wanted to call you woman to woman without my mother listening in, she said, and I could almost picture her choosing each word carefully, rehearsing this call before she made it. I think there's a way to handle this that doesn't have to blow up the whole family. What if Daniel just took a settlement, a clean, generous one, and let the rest of the trust stay as it is? You two could finally have real money, no lawyers, no ugly accounting fights, no more digging through old paperwork. Wouldn't that be easier for everyone? Wouldn't you rather just move on with your life than spend the next year fighting my mother in court? I recognized it immediately for what it was, a bribe wrapped in the language of practicality, an offer designed to make me feel like accepting less than what Daniel was legally owed was somehow the mature, reasonable choice, the choice a good wife would make rather than a greedy one. A few weeks earlier, exhausted and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what we'd discovered, I might have been tempted just to make the conflict stop, to take whatever quiet number they offered and disappear back into our small, manageable life. But I had seen the actual documents by then. I knew exactly what was at stake, and I knew a quiet settlement would mean Eleanor and Claire kept control over money that legally, transparently belonged to Daniel, and that whatever they were so desperate to keep hidden behind that consensus clause would simply stay hidden, indefinitely, protected by my own willingness to look away. "We're not interested in a quiet settlement, Claire," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, surprising even myself. "We want the accounting. If everything's been handled properly all these years, there's nothing for either of you to worry about." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I almost thought she'd hung up without saying goodbye. "You're making a mistake," she finally said, and the softness was gone from her voice now, replaced by something colder, something closer to the woman who'd stood glaring at me from behind her mother in the driveway. Then she ended the call without another word, the silence afterward feeling almost louder than the conversation itself. I told Daniel about the conversation that night, watching his face carefully as I relayed it. And rather than the guilt or hesitation I might have expected from him weeks earlier, he just shook his head slowly, something hardening in his expression. "She's scared," he said. "My mother's scared too. People don't fight that hard to protect something unless they're afraid of what happens if you actually look at it closely." It was the most clear-eyed thing I'd heard him say about his own family since this had started, and it told me something important. Whatever fear or guilt had kept him compliant for years was beginning, slowly but unmistakably, to lose its grip. Over the following days, I leaned more heavily on the people I trusted. My mother, my younger sister who called every other night just to check in, a close friend from college who worked in finance and helped me understand, in plain English over a long phone call, what a forensic accounting of a trust actually involved and what kinds of red flags it tended to uncover. Their steady presence didn't make the fear disappear entirely, but it gave me something solid to stand on besides my own fraying nerves. Eleanor and Claire, for their part, went quiet for almost 2 weeks. No calls, no visits, no further attempts at persuasion, which felt less like peace and more like the particular, charged kind of silence that precedes a storm. The call came from Eleanor herself this time, her voice warm and almost maternal in a way that immediately put me on edge precisely because it was so unlike the woman who had stood in our driveway threatening to disinherit her own son just 2 weeks earlier. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," she said, her tone carrying the practiced ease of someone accustomed to smoothing over conflicts with charm rather than honesty. "Why don't you and Daniel come up to Hartford this weekend? Just a family dinner. No lawyers, no documents. I think we all said things we regretted, and I'd like the chance to start over." Against my instinct, which screamed that this was simply another move in a longer game, I agreed, mostly because Patricia had advised that refusing all contact entirely might look, to a judge later if it came to that, like we were the ones escalating things unreasonably rather than acting in good faith. Daniel and I drove up together on Saturday morning, and I spent most of the 4-hour trip rehearsing, in my head, every possible way the evening could unravel, trying to anticipate the angles I hadn't yet considered. Eleanor's house in Hartford was exactly as I remembered it from our wedding. Tasteful, understated, the kind of old money that didn't need to announce itself with anything as crude as ostentation. Dinner began pleasantly enough, almost unnervingly so, the candlelight and good china creating an atmosphere that felt deliberately disarming. Eleanor asked about my teaching job with what seemed like genuine interest, even remembering the names of 2 students I'd mentioned months earlier. Claire complimented my dress, refilled my wine glass without being asked, laughed easily at small jokes. For nearly an hour it felt almost like the family I'd always wished I'd married into, and some small, tired part of me wanted desperately to believe it was real. The shift happened over dessert, subtle at first, the way a temperature drops before you notice you've started shivering. Eleanor mentioned, almost as an aside while cutting into a slice of pie, how hard it had been to watch Robert build the trust from nothing, how she'd spent decades protecting it from people who didn't understand what real wealth required. Discipline, sacrifice, loyalty, the kind of patience most people simply don't have anymore. Claire picked up the thread smoothly, almost seamlessly, talking about a cousin years ago who had married into money and ruined everything within a few years through reckless spending and an inability to understand what it took to build something lasting, laying out a cautionary tale with a practiced casualness that made it unmistakably clear who the unspoken subject of the story was. Then Eleanor turned to me directly, her tone still gentle but unmistakably aimed now, the warmth in her voice not quite covering the steel underneath. "Sarah, dear, I know this has felt confusing for you, jumping into a family with this kind of history, but I want you to understand. Daniel's father built this so that Daniel would always be taken care of, on our terms, by people who love him and understand what's at stake. Forcing an outside accounting, bringing in lawyers, it doesn't protect Daniel. It just exposes the family to people who don't have his best interests at heart. Surely you can see that, can't you? You're a sensible woman." I understood in that moment exactly what kind of conversation this was. Not reconciliation, not even close, but a more polished, more dangerous attempt at the same manipulation Claire had tried over the phone weeks earlier, except now wrapped in performance of love and family unity instead of a blunt financial offer, delivered across candlelight and good china instead of over a cold phone line. They wanted me to feel like an outsider intruding on something sacred, to doubt my own right to want transparency in my own marriage, to internalize their version of events until I started apologizing for asking questions I had every right to ask. "With respect," I said, keeping my voice even despite the heat rising in my chest, "an accounting isn't an attack on the family. It's a basic legal right Daniel has as a beneficiary. If everything's been handled the way you're describing, the accounting will show exactly that, and none of this will matter. There's nothing to fear from the truth if the truth is on your side." Eleanor's pleasant mask slipped, just slightly, a flicker of something harder beneath it, visible for only a second before she smoothed it back into place. "You don't understand what you're risking," she said, quieter now, almost a warning, the candlelight catching something cold in her eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Daniel, who had been mostly silent through dinner, watching the exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, finally spoke, his voice steady in a way I hadn't heard from him before this entire ordeal began, a steadiness that seemed to surprise even him. "I understand exactly what I'm risking, Mom. I understand I spent 30 years believing I had nothing because you and Claire decided that's what was best for me. I'm done deciding things are fine just because it keeps the peace. I'm done being managed." The silence after that lasted long enough to feel physical, pressing against the walls of the dining room like something solid. Claire's composure cracked first, her voice rising sharply as she accused Daniel of being manipulated by some woman who married him 5 minutes ago, relatively speaking, who doesn't understand 30 years of this family's history. While Eleanor sat rigid at the head of the table, her jaw tight, her hands folded with white knuckles against the tablecloth, saying nothing at all, which somehow felt more dangerous than any outburst Claire could manage. We left shortly after, declining dessert seconds and coffee with as much politeness as either of us could muster. The drive home quiet except for the hum of the highway and the occasional pair of headlights sweeping past in the opposite direction. I felt a small, cold thread of fear settle in my stomach during that long drive, the kind that comes from watching people you once thought of as family reveal exactly how far they might go to protect what they believed was theirs, how thin the performance of love had been all along. But underneath that fear was something stronger now, something that had been building in me for weeks, hardening with every confrontation, the absolute certainty that I would not be talked out of the truth, no matter how many dinners, how many soft voices, how many warnings dressed up carefully as love. 3 weeks after that dinner, the forensic accountant Patricia had recommended, a meticulous woman named Renata, who specialized in trust disputes, finished her review of the financial records Eleanor's attorneys had been legally compelled to produce. She requested a meeting with all of us in Patricia's conference room. Daniel and me on one side of the table, Eleanor and Claire, accompanied by their own attorney, on the other. Renata laid out her findings with the same flat, unemotional precision she probably used for every case, which somehow made the revelations land harder than if she'd delivered them with any drama at all. Over the past 6 years, she explained, the trust had made 11 separate disbursements labeled as administrative expenses or trust management costs, totaling just over $2 million. Cross-referencing bank records, those disbursements corresponded almost exactly, in timing and amount, to cash injections into a boutique clothing business owned and operated by Claire Whitman Dahliel, a business that, according to its own public filings, had been operating at a consistent loss for years. In several instances, Renata continued, sliding documents across the table, the disbursement authorizations bear what appears to be Daniel Whitman's signature. I'd recommend a handwriting analysis because based on signature samples provided by Mr. Whitman today, these do not appear to be a match. The room went very still. Claire's face had drained of color, her earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by something close to panic. "Those were authorized," she said too quickly, her voice climbing in pitch. "Mom signed off on those. It was a temporary loan. We were going to pay it back once the store turned a profit." "Claire," Eleanor said sharply, a clear warning to stop talking. But it was too late, and everyone in the room had heard exactly what she'd admitted. I watched Daniel beside me absorb this with a stillness that surprised me. Not shock, not even anger, but something colder and more settled. The look of a man finally seeing clearly after years of deliberately not looking. "You forged my signature," he said quietly, not a question, "to fund Claire's store," while telling me there was nothing left for either of us. Eleanor's attorney attempted to intervene, suggesting this could be resolved through an internal family agreement rather than escalating further. But Patricia cut in smoothly, citing the clear evidence of breach of fiduciary duty and likely forgery, stating plainly that her clients had every legal right to pursue removal of the current trustees and a full restoration of the misappropriated funds, with the option of pursuing criminal referral for the forgery if they chose. Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice losing the commanding edge it had carried through every previous confrontation, replaced now with something brittle and defensive. "Everything we did to protect this family, to protect Daniel from people who would take advantage of him." Her eyes flicked toward me as she said it. The accusation's still alive even now, even with $2 million of forged signatures laid out on the table between us. "You didn't protect me," Daniel said, and his voice didn't rise, didn't shake. "You controlled me. There's a difference, and I think some part of you has always known that." Claire had started crying, not gracefully, blurting half-formed justifications about pressure and expectations, and how she'd never meant for it to go this far, how she'd intended to pay it back before anyone noticed. Eleanor sat rigid beside her daughter, no longer the composed matriarch who had hosted us at her elegant table weeks earlier, but a woman watching, in real time, the unraveling of a control she had spent decades building. I said very little through most of the meeting, letting the documents and Daniel's own steady resolve speak louder than anything I could have added. When Eleanor's eyes met mine again, searching, I think, for some flicker of the uncertainty she'd once seen in me, I gave her nothing, just the same calm, level gaze I'd been holding since Renata first opened her folder. There was no triumph in it, not yet, just the quiet certainty of someone who had finally been proven right. In writing, in numbers, no one could argue away. The weeks that followed moved with a kind of legal momentum that felt almost surreal after months of uncertainty. Patricia filed formally for the removal of Eleanor as trustee and Claire as co-trustee, citing the documented breach of fiduciary duty and the forged disbursement authorizations Renata's report had uncovered. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the very real threat of criminal forgery charges, Eleanor's attorney advised her to avoid a prolonged court battle. And within 6 weeks, a settlement was reached that neither Eleanor nor Claire had any leverage left to negotiate. The terms were unambiguous. Eleanor was removed as trustee entirely, replaced by a neutral court-appointed fiduciary. Daniel's full beneficiary rights were restored without any consensus clause or family approval required, and the trust was ordered to reimburse in full the more than $2 million diverted into Claire's business, drawn directly from Claire's and Eleanor's remaining personal assets rather than the trust itself, since the funds had clearly been misappropriated for personal benefit. Claire, facing a separate criminal referral for forgery that her own attorney admitted she had little chance of beating in court, accepted a plea agreement involving probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her professional life. There was no dramatic courtroom shouting match, no movie-style reckoning, just paperwork, signatures, and the quiet, absolute finality of consequences finally catching up to people who had spent years assuming they never would. Daniel signed the final trust documents in Patricia's office on a gray Thursday afternoon, and when he set the pen down, he didn't smile or celebrate. He just exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been holding his breath for the better part of 3 decades. I felt the wind differently than I expected to. I had braced myself for something triumphant, some surge of vindication after months of being called a gold digger, an outsider, a threat to a family I'd married into in good faith. Instead, what I felt was simpler and quieter. Relief. The kind that comes not from defeating an enemy, but from finally being able to stop fighting at all. Eleanor did not call to apologize, not then, and not in the months that followed. The last interaction I had with her was a brief, clipped email forwarded through her attorney, requesting that any further communication go through official channels. Claire sent one message to Daniel, just a single line, "I hope you're happy," that read less like genuine well-wishing and more like a final, bitter accusation, as though Daniel's happiness had somehow been stolen from her rather than simply restored to him. We didn't gloat. We didn't throw the victory in anyone's face, even when it would have been easy to. Daniel, in particular, seemed to carry the resolution with a strange, heavy solemnity rather than joy, the weight of finally understanding how completely his own family had used him, settling into him slowly in the quiet weeks after the settlement was finalized. For me, the clearest measure of how far we'd come came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, a few weeks after everything was resolved, when Daniel came home from the bank where we'd finally opened proper accounts in both our names, fully transparent, fully shared, and sat down across from me at our kitchen table, the same scratched, second-hand table we'd eaten on for years, and said simply, "I never want to keep anything from you again. Not money, not fear, not my family, nothing." It wasn't a grand declaration. It was just true in the plain, unremarkable way that the truest things often are. The months that followed our settlement reshaped our lives less around the money itself and more around what honesty had finally made possible between us. We didn't move into a sprawling estate or quit our jobs overnight. Instead, we paid off our debts, fixed the furnace that had grown through 6 winters, and bought a modest, sun-filled house just outside Dayton with an actual yard. A small, unremarkable upgrade that felt enormous after years of careful scarcity. I finally scheduled the fertility consultation I'd canceled years earlier, and 8 months later, Daniel and I learned we were expecting our first child. News that felt, after everything, like a quiet promise about the kind of family we intended to build. One without secrets, without locked drawers, without a leash disguised as love. Daniel used part of his inheritance to start a small scholarship fund for first-generation college students, something he wanted to do specifically because his own education had been funded under the guise of poverty, while real wealth sat hidden behind him. I went back to teaching, not because we needed the income anymore, but because I genuinely loved the work, and for the first time I did it without the constant hum of financial anxiety underneath every lesson plan. Claire's life, by contrast, unraveled in slow, public increments. Her boutique, stripped of the fraudulent funding that had kept it artificially alive, closed permanently within 4 months, the storefront sitting empty with a faded "for lease" sign that, according to a mutual acquaintance still in Hartford, became something of a quiet local joke. Her probation made finding new employment difficult once word of the forgery conviction spread through their social circle. Her marriage, already strained, ended within the year. Her husband citing a loss of trust he said he couldn't recover from. Eleanor fared in some ways worse, precisely because money had been the foundation of nearly all her remaining relationships. Stripped of her role as trustee, she found herself increasingly isolated from circles that had only ever respected what she controlled, not who she was. Daniel made some effort to stay in contact with her, driven less by forgiveness than by lingering obligation, but their calls stayed brief, formal, and increasingly rare. She never once, in any conversation Daniel relayed to me, expressed genuine remorse, only a simmering bitterness that the family's secrets had finally been dragged into the light. I won't pretend I never thought about them. Some nights, rocking our daughter to sleep in the nursery, we'd painted a soft yellow. I'd think about how close I'd come to simply accepting the explanations I was given, how easily a quieter version of myself might have let the truth stay buried in a locked drawer forever. But I hadn't, and the life we'd built because of that choice felt sturdier, more honest, and entirely our own in a way no inherited fortune could have provided on its own. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. I'd love to know what you would have done in my place. Thank you so much for listening.